Mention 1904 to a longtime St. Louisan, and these are the images that will surely come to mind. But many have forgotten the World's Fair had a companion event that changed the world of sports: the first American Olympics.
Sports was just starting in the United States. Sports didn't really become a thing till after the Civil War, when we had a little more leisure time and everything like that. So it was really an introduction of sports to a lot of the United States.
In many ways, the 1904 Games were very little like today's Olympics, with events that looked more like a cross between a high school track meet and a family picnic. But the St. Louis Games did leave a lasting mark on today's Olympics.
There were some real good innovations here. One of the biggest legacy that St. Louis gave to the Olympics is we're the birthplace of the gold medal. So we said we're going to do gold, silver, and bronze. And that's how it's been ever since.
With the help of Olympic historian Michael Loynd, we hear some of the more rarely told stories about the 1904 Olympics and how the St. Louis Games turned what was nearly a defeated dream into a global sensation.
We introduced the Games to the United States. They were coming off life support in Paris. Had America not gotten behind the Olympics, I don't think they would have succeeded as we know them today. And the reason America got behind them was a lot to do with the 1904 Olympics.
Well, Michael Loynd, welcome back to HEC. It's good to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Paul. I appreciate it.
The last time that Michael was with us was when his book, The Waterman, came out about swimming in the 1904 Olympics in St. Louis, which we'll get to in a little bit and put it in the context of the 1904 Olympics. But first, we need to put the 1904 Olympics into context because it was one of the first games of the modern games. Just give us the timeline of where it falls in that.
Yeah, so it was America's first Olympics, and there were 3 Olympics before that. There was one in 1896, which was in Athens. That was the first one. There was one in 1900 in Paris, which historically you can argue that it didn't even happen. But, and yeah, believe it or not, they were just kind of a mess. They were trying to get started, you know. And it was a time when there wasn't mass media around, so it was hard to get the world to grab it. And then we were the third. We were the third in 1904.
Well, in addition to having written The Waterman, you have the word Olympic in several titles that you have, several hats that you wear. Give us all of that so we know for the folks what you're speaking of.
So I am, I'm chairman of the Sports Commission, and as a result of that, I'm on our Olympic Legacy Committee, and I was invited to join the World Union of Olympic Cities, which every city who's hosted an Olympics has 2 delegates on the World Union of Olympic Cities. It's part of the IOC, which is exciting. So once a year we meet up somewhere in the world and you get to interact with all these other wonderful cities and hear what they're doing. And it also is a way to activate our legacy with Olympic trials, ongoing things, and it helped us get the rings at WashU, a big Olympic ring sculpture at WashU, which is great. And I'm also part of the International Society of Olympic Historians as well.
Wow. So does that mean you get to vote on who has the Olympics?
I get 0 vote. We are a very low-level committee, but we do have a door to the IOC, which is nice. So anything going on with the Olympics. Perfect example is the LA Olympics will be here in 4 years, and we hope to get the torch back through St. Louis, which would be great, among a few other things.
Right. Are the rings still out of WashU?
They are. It's a beautiful sculpture right by the stadium where they hosted the Olympics, which is the oldest modern-day Olympic stadium.
Get them to run the torch right past that.
Yeah, right. It'd
Great
be fantastic.
photo
right?
opportunity.
Absolutely.
So you said Paris. It was Athens first.
It was.
Which, of course, was where it always was back in the day.
Yes.
But then Paris, and it was nothing like the modern day Olympics. It wasn't even hardly a game. It was just a mess, right?
No, it was a mess. So Pierre de Coubertin is the father of the modern day Olympics. He got the idea from a doctor in England, Dr. William Pennybrooks, who they were having an Olympic festival there for 50, 60 years. He invited Pierre de Coubertin to take a look. Dr. Pennybrooks was getting older, and Coubertin said, this is a great idea. So he tried to introduce the modern games to the world, and nobody was interested. International travel was very difficult. England, who was the father of sports, pretty much said, look, if you want to compete with the best in the world, all you have to do is come to England. And we're not going to go, travel, send our athletes all around the world to these games. So Coubertin came to the United States, tried to pitch it. Our amateur athletic union was not interested, James E. Sullivan. He said, nope, this just sounds stupid. So he pitched it to the Athenians, the Greeks, and said, look, this is a great way to celebrate ancient Greece in all its glory. And they bought into it. So it basically was a big patriotic festival more than an Olympic ceremony. They had games, but the Greeks weren't familiar with modern sports. And they came more because the king was going to be there and the queen was going to be there, and that's how it started. And we sent athletes over there, and we did well, and we got interested in it. And then Paris started, which is where Coubertin was from, and said this is going to be the big coming out party of the Olympics. They're having a World's Fair here, and they're looking for something to rival the Eiffel Tower, because that came out in 1889, I think, at their last World's Fair. And he said, we're going to just build a great big stadium for this events we called sports, and the French could care less about sports. So they said, forget it. We're not going to do anything. They didn't even use the name Olympics in the events. Their awards were anything from medals to bowls to ribbons. One swimmer got a 50-pound bronze statue of a horse. Figure that out. So it was just kind of a mess. And most of the athletes who competed there said it was awful.
Athens, Paris, St. Louis. One of these things is not like the other.
Right.
How did St. Louis manage to snag the third Olympics?
Right. So Pierre de Coubertin originally wanted it to go to London because, again, that's the father of modern sports. And after Paris, it was pretty much on life support. So, and England's like, nah, we do not want it at all. Those games are so bad, it'd be a frost if it came to England, is what they said. So America was the only one who was interested in it. James E. Sullivan, who was the amateur athletic union president, really wanted him here. Coubertin hated James Sullivan. James Sullivan hated Coubertin. So Coubertin reached out to a friend of his at the University of Chicago to kind of pull it away from Sullivan's grasp. And that's where St. Louis stepped in, because they were set for 1904. The World's Fair was actually set for 1903, which not too many people know about it, but delays caused it to be pushed another year in construction. So once it reached 1904, it was David Francis, who was former governor, former mayor of St. Louis, the person who was in charge of bringing the World's Fair to St. Louis. He said, I want those Olympic Games. He said, there's not going to be another international competition or event in the United States this summer outside of St. Louis. So St. Louis had all the money. We had all the power. All the athletes were coming here to compete in the amateur games. All the trains were set to come into St. Louis at the time. We were the fourth biggest city, and Chicago conceded. They really didn't have a choice in the matter, because we were already building a stadium and everything like that. So that's how St. Louis stole the games from Chicago.
But at one point, wasn't Chicago told they were going to get the games?
They were absolutely told they were going to get the games. So Pierre de Coubertin awarded them to Chicago, made a very public statement about it. Again, it was to thwart James Sullivan. He didn't want it to go to James Sullivan. And ironically, then David Francis appointed David Sullivan as the head of physical culture at the 1904 World's Fair, which in essence put him in charge of the Olympic Games.
And Chicago is still mad at us.
And Chicago is still mad at us. They have other things, but yeah, we did get the games from them, which is a nice feather in our cap.
So what were these games like? Did they look anything like what we think of when we think of the Olympics today?
Surprisingly enough, so the Paris Games, they didn't even have a stadium there. Like, the athletes ran on a grass field. Just to give you, the hammer throwers and the shot putters had to throw around a big oak tree in the middle of this field. We built the first modern-day stadium. If you ever look at the Athens Stadium, it was one of the ancient stadiums that they refurbished, and the track has this wicked hairpin turn that was not good for any runner. So we built a third-of-a-mile track. It was the first modern-day track built at the time for the Olympics. We built the stadium. We had the first announcer here. We put signs up and did chalk lines so the audience could follow the throws and everything like that. So there were some real good innovations here. And one of the biggest things biggest legacy that St. Louis gave to the Olympics is we're the birthplace of the gold medal. So before us, again, Paris was a mess. Athens was silver and copper for first and second. There was no third. So we said we're going to do gold, silver, and bronze. And that's how it's been ever since. So it's a big accolade for us, I think. And then our host of athletes was just a remarkable, diverse bunch that the Olympics had not seen before.
And how was this tied in with the World's Fair? They were held simultaneously.
Yeah, so one interesting fact that not people know, sports was just starting in the United States. Sports didn't really become a thing till after the Civil War, when we had a little more leisure time and everything like that. So it was really an introduction of sports to a lot of the United States. Certainly beyond, we had baseball, we had college football, track was a known entity, but beyond that, nothing else. Swimming was really unheard of in the United States.
Well, I understand David Francis wasn't even that interested in sports.
He wasn't that interested in sports, but he saw it as a key asset for the 1904 World's Fair. And that's why he wanted it. So, I mean, Dave Francis was a visionary too, and I think he saw the potential of what this could be. And it was a great way to America to make its mark on a world stage. When we were just a young country and trying to get some cachet, at the international table.
So how did these things work together? Was it like when you go to, I don't know, Six Flags or someplace and there's a water park, and if you buy entrance to one, you get to go in the other, or two separate things that just happen to be at the same time,
so
close to the same location?
Yeah, so people typically entered the World's Fair at the Pike, which is now where the History Museum is. And if you think about where Francis Field is, that's a long way to go. It's what, a mile and a half probably to get there. People were in gowns, people were in suits. It was very hot during that time. So they had like a little train that would go around that people could, buy a ticket on, and you can go to the Olympic venue. I don't know if they had tickets per se, to be honest with you. I think the stadium was just kind of an open exhibit, but I don't know that for sure.
They were just glad if people showed up.
Yeah, they were.
Were there some categories that were there in 1904 that aren't there anymore, and vice versa?
Yeah, they had the tug of war, which I'd love for them to bring back, because that just seemed like a lot of fun. And there were some other strange events they had there. Swimming, they had this plunge for distance, which they don't have anymore.
Did they have something called fancy diving?
Fancy diving was diving in essence, but that was the first time diving was ever at the Olympics, was here in 1904. They had a standing high jump and standing long jump. So you couldn't run up to it, you just stood and then you jumped. And a guy by the name of Ray Erie, who won all those events in Paris, then won all of them here. He's an amazing Olympian. They called him the human frog. After he had dominated the sport, they kind of ended it because they're like, nobody's as good as him. And it just didn't evolve after this one.
Did they have archery too? Do I remember?
They had archery, and that was the first women who competed. Paris claimed they were the first to have women athletes. And in retrospect, they were, but that designation wasn't given until about 60, 70 years later, when the IOC said, look, we got to sift through these games at Paris and figure out what was really Olympic and what wasn't. And so most of the few women who competed didn't even know they were Olympians. Most of them, and some of them even died before that even happened. I think it was Margaret Abbott who won the golf there, and she died before she ever received that Olympic designation. And they didn't know that was Olympics back then. But ours, at archery, that was an Olympic designated sport. The women who competed did in fact know they were competing as Olympians. So that's really the first modern day women Olympic competition.
I'm going to hate myself for saying this, but let's do a deep dive into swimming.
Okay.
Because I know that you did one a couple of years ago when you wrote the book,
Yeah.
The Waterman. So we didn't have a pool though, right?
We didn't. The MAC was just built, so they had a pool, and that was really one of the only pools in town. There was probably, at 1904, about a dozen indoor pools in the entire country. There was only about 600 amateur swimmers in the entire country. Of 75 million people, we weren't swimmers. So, but they did have swimming at the games. James E. Sullivan, and this is a really cool thing, James E. Sullivan did not care about any other sports except track and field. And he said, I'm putting on track and field. It's going to be, I think it was like a week to 10 days at Francis Field. And any of the other sports, your designated bodies can organize an Olympic sport, but I'm not going to do it. So swimming, the reason why that happened here in St. Louis was the MAC. The MAC people said, look, we want swimming to happen. We were actually very good swimmers. Our swimmers were MAC was one of the top swimming programs in the country back then. And they put it on at Life Saving Lake, which doesn't exist anymore. I think it's a Presbyterian church right now where it was, but it was right by the big Ferris wheel. And there's all these rumors that the Palace of Agriculture, all their livestock would defecate in there and all kinds of stuff. So it wasn't a great place to go swimming, that's for sure. But that is where they swam. And it really kept the Olympic sport of swimming alive. Not only that, but we did well because of Charles Daniels. And he actually set a world record, which the English refused to acknowledge. They were the top for 50 years, were the top swimmer. Nobody had ever beaten them. They did not come to these games. They thought it was beneath them. But Charles Daniels would eventually beat the British at the 1908 London Olympics.
Well, let's talk about him for a moment, because, the one thing we know is that people who do know something about the 1904 Olympics usually cite the same 2 or 3 anecdotes about the guy who drank the strychnine and the guy who caught a ride in the middle of the marathon.
Right.
But Charles Daniels' story was relatively unknown until you wrote your book, The Waterman. Who was he and what made him so spectacular?
It was he. So he was born to a very wealthy family in Buffalo. His father basically turned out to be a big Wall Street swindler, Bernie Madoff of the day, in many degrees. They were thrown out of society, and again, the sport of swimming was just not popular at all here, and it was the only place where he was welcomed. And so he used swimming as a way to get his name back and get them back into just some decent way of life, and became this incredible swimmer. He invented the freestyle stroke. He started USA Swimming here. He traveled around nationally to promote the sport at a time when there wasn't any real media, no radio, no nothing. And so he was really the father of USA Swimming. And I always kind of find that interesting because it's the most dominant legacy and dynasty in all of the Olympics, our USA Swimming team. We've won more gold medals than the next 11 countries combined, which is just incredible. So that shows you coming from zero, where nobody was into swimming, to what he was able to do.
That's why England is still mad at us.
Right, exactly. Exactly.
How did these athletes qualify? I guess they probably had to be rich people to afford to travel. I mean, there wasn't this sort of ecosystem like there is now, right?
Well, that's true. There wasn't really an Olympic committee to raise money for these athletes. So they either, their clubs, if they were part of a club, they raised money. YMCAs raised money for them. And sometimes just the small towns that they were from raised money for them. And at the 1904 Olympics, one interesting fact was the athletes competed for their clubs rather than their countries. It was the last Olympics where they would do that.
I imagine there are a ton of other great stories from the Olympics. Do you have another favorite?
George Pogue is a great story because he was born, his parents were slaves, and he was born in Hannibal, Missouri, so he's kind of a close to favorite son. And he was the first African-American athlete to medal at the Games. He won 2 bronze medals in the hurdles. He competed for the Milwaukee Athletic Club, and he was an incredible athlete at Wisconsin. And then he actually became a teacher here in St. Louis. So I love his story. George Iser's another one. He was the first physically disabled individual to compete at the Games and win medals. He won 6 medals competing in gymnastics with a wooden leg, and just was an incredible athlete. So those are 2 of my favorite stories. Again, I like underdogs, and they definitely did a great job.
Are there some misconceptions about the 1904 Games, do you think?
People compare the Games now, if you look back at them, to, like, if I have a Model T and I compare it to a modern day Corvette, let's say, or something like that, you'd say, well, that Model T is garbage. But at the time, it was wonderful. And the Games were very early in their infancy. So again, we were still working through a lot of stuff here in America. There was segregation, certainly in the stands. That was kind of part of the 1904 World's Fair. James E. Sullivan did not want it, or nor did David E. Francis, but that's just how it was. And it's a sad fact, but it's also just a reality of the time. But the games themselves, the athletes were open to all races and countries and backgrounds and stuff like that. So that was a good accolade.
There weren't a whole lot of countries represented here, though, right?
There weren't, and a lot of that was because of travel. It was very expensive to travel here. A lot of the Europeans did not come here as a result of that. The athletes really, they weren't paid at all. So to take off work for a month to come here and compete in an event that was where the Olympics weren't the big thing they are now, it was a little unrealistic. But it was the most foreign athletes on U.S. soil ever to compete at one time.
Did it get much international press coverage?
It got great national coverage. So that was the big accomplishment of the 1904 Games. It introduced America to the Olympics for the first time. The coverage was very regular. The coverage was, on some of the front page headlines. And that was the first time the games had ever been covered that way. And America saw that we were winning medals, and they liked that. So they said, "Well, when are the next Olympic Games?" And that got us kind of hooked on the games after that. So that was a big thing St. Louis did.
Were the St. Louis Games considered successful? I mean, there must have been critics in all that coverage.
At the time, they were. Yeah, I mean, if you look at the London Times and all the papers around the nation, they were very much considered a success. Pierre de Coubertin even said they were a big success at the time, and then much later in his biography, he kind of trashed the games. I think in part because he didn't want James E. Sullivan to get a lot of credit. It's true. And he was trying to solidify his legacy, and the games, he kind of washed his hands of the 1904 Games. And to have them be successful and Paris not be successful, I don't think that he liked that. So he wasn't too kind with us.
Were there some other famous St. Louisans, other than David Francis, who were involved in bringing the games here, names we might recognize still today, or long forgotten?
You know what? There were some big civic leaders at the times who we would probably recognize the names, but David E. Francis was the big visionary of getting the games here.
How long did it run? Was it a couple of weeks, and was it every day?
So it ran throughout the fair, but really the main Olympics, again, with James E. Sullivan's vision, lasted about 10 days, and that was at the stadium itself, and that was track and field. And again, all the other events he left up to their individual sports bodies. Tennis was put on by Dwight Davis, who we know from the Davis Cup. He was a St. Louisan, and he organized that. And again, swimming was the MAC, and all these other events were organized by different governing bodies. So,
did St. Louis athletes go on to other Olympics who had been at the 1904 Games?
Well, Charles Daniels certainly did. A lot of the athletes did. One athlete here who competed at the 1900 Paris Games was a guy by the name of Albert Lambert, who we know Lambert Field. His family owned the Listerine company at the time. Well, that was one of their big products. But he was a flight enthusiast, and he was a golfer, big golfer. So he competed in Paris, and he competed here. And I think he won a bronze medal with the U.S. Olympic team in golf here.
Other than Francis Field, are there any other physical relics left from those days?
Some of that stadium is still the original stadium.
Really?
Which is pretty incredible. At the time, it was the biggest concrete stadium structure, I think, at the time, which is kind of neat. But the part of Francis Field that you still see now, the stadium, that is still the original 1904.
I think, was wrestling new at the 1904 Games?
I believe they did have wrestling. Basketball was new, and boxing, I believe, was new, and that was here.
So that sort of begs the question, what is St. Louis's legacy with regard to the modern-day Olympics?
Well, the biggest legacy internationally is probably the gold, silver, bronze medal. And the second biggest thing is we introduced the games to the United States. And again, they were coming off life support in Paris. Had America not gotten behind the Olympics, I don't think they would have succeeded as we know them today. And the reason America got behind them was a lot to do with the 1904 Olympics.
Has there ever been talk of trying to get the Olympics back in St. Louis?
I think there's always a little talk about that. They've just become this big, grandiose production, and it's very expensive to put them on. So you don't want to just throw a party. I think if we could figure out a way where it could benefit St. Louis going forward, I think there's a conversation to be had. We definitely have the door open to the IOC to have that conversation with them. Typically what you'd have to do is you have to get the U.S. Olympic Committee to say, okay, you can go forward to the IOC and request the games at this certain year. And usually there's about a 12-year lag from the last U.S. Olympics, whether they're winter or summer. So 28's in LA. So you go 12 years forward, that would be 2040. So that would probably be the earliest we'd have a chance, 2040, 2044, if we ever were to do something like that. But, it would be interesting if we ever reached out to Chicago and tried to partner with them, which the IOC is allowing cities to do now.
How would that work?
Well, perfect example is Italy, the Winter Olympics coming forward. They're 2 cities, and they're about as far as us in Chicago. So trains and planes, they help a lot, as far as getting the athletes back and forth. But that could be a possibility.
That would be an interesting combination.
Yeah, never know. Never know. But it'd have to make sense for all the cities involved.
I think Chicago might have a better shot at it than us, but who knows?
Yeah, they tried and didn't get it the last time they came out. But interesting history, again, Athens has gotten it. We're a lot bigger than that. St. Louis is a lot bigger than Athens. London has gotten it. Paris has gotten it again. We're the only one of the first 4 who hasn't gotten a second. So
we're due.
There's right. There's a little story to be told, I think, with the history behind it.
Well, unfortunately, your position doesn't give you a vote. But you could probably bend a few ears, maybe.
We don't have a vote. The biggest thing we could do is, again, if that ever made sense, I think St. Louis would need to partner with another city like a Chicago, a Nashville, potentially, something like that would make sense, and put together a very good bid and go forward from there. But you also have to get the U.S. Olympic Committee here's approval to go forward.
Well, if anybody could do it.
Well, we'll see. We'll see. I don't know if that's in the conversation, but it certainly is a little bit of possibility. But what we're focused on now is basically bringing Olympic trials here to St. Louis, like we did with USA Gymnastics a few years ago. We'd love to try to get ice skating here. We'd love to get gymnastics trials here again, swimming here, stuff like that. So that's the kind of stuff that we are definitely gettable.
Yeah, in some ways, it's kind of just as entertaining and a lot less difficult to stage.
That is for sure. That is for sure. I mean, you really disrupt the city when you bring in Olympic Games in there, but they're also wonderful. It's a wonderful celebration. Bringing the international community anywhere together is a wonderful experience. Just interacting with everybody from all over the world and getting different perspectives and all celebrating sport and just a good positive thing for all of us, which we need more of in the world today.
Well, we'll keep our fingers crossed for St. Louis.
Yeah, right.
For my age, I'll cross them on both hands and cross my toes. And who knows, we might just have them here. Michael Loynd, thanks so much for the conversation. Really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you, Paul. I appreciate it.